And we've been talking about tactics, and over our last couple sessions, we talked about the first tactic is what do you mean by that? And asking that question in a conversation essentially allows your partner in the conversation to begin explaining their point of view. By understanding their point of view, you're going to be able to be in a better position to raise other questions that will help clarify and refine that point of view and also bring in additional comments or observations from your side. The second tactic is to ask the question, how did you come to that conclusion? And so I've been visiting with my friend Jacob Varghese. And Jacob, welcome. And we want to just kind of pick up where we left off before talking about these tactics. So we talked about the first tactic is what do you mean by that? By the way, why is that so important to ask that question?
Well, Kerry, just happy to be here back with you. And yes, just revisiting what we talked in our previous videos on the question of what do you mean by that? That question is very much important because oftentimes we may not fully understand what the other person's position is. We may misunderstand their position, to put it simply, and they might be at certain points be in a disadvantaged point of conversation where they may not be able to properly and clearly convey what they actually hold on to. So in the hurry of the conversation, in the hurry of the moment, they might misrepresent their position. So I don't want to misunderstand their position, and I don't want them to misrepresent their position. And that actually ties down into what the core of what we're doing. I mean, our point is not to win the argument. If my point is to win the argument, and that's all I'm looking at, then I'm happy that they're misrepresenting their position. I can easily take that down. But I don't want that to happen. I want them to engage in a proper conversation with me. I want to understand what they're talking about, and I want to fully understand what their structure is and make sure if they really understand what they're actually talking about, or if they just pick this statement from a book or not, and then engage
Yeah.
into a proper conversation.
Yeah, really. So that's the opening question. Essentially, is what do you mean by that? We follow that question up with another question, and that tell us a little bit about the second question that can help us in our pursuit of tactics and in working with individuals.
Yeah, and the second question is, how did you come to that conclusion? So this actually, like you said, follows up with the first question. And when we ask, how did you come to that conclusion? We're just trying to see if their position really has merit. Do they have good reasons to think what they're thinking? And we are testing the waters and seeing if they really understand their own position. Like I said, something similar to what we did in the first question. Are they properly understanding their position, or did they read it off some book, maybe some comic, some comedian said some statement and they just picked it off at that? And we're trying to see what are the strongholds of that position that we can engage with. What are the pillars upon which their argument, the roof stands, so that we can engage
Yeah.
with those pillars and take on the argument.
Okay, so that leads us into kind of the initial phases of the conversation. So where would we go from here? What's the next move when we're talking about tactics?
Yeah, and the third question is Greg Kokel mentions this in his book as the leading question. So this is where both the questions come into play. I mean, you asked what do you mean by that, and you understand their position. Then you ask them how did you come to their conclusion. You try and figure out what are the reasons, what are their arguments for that position, and then now you deploy your knowledge base with the leading question. And that's not exactly a set down ready-made question that can take up different forms. But in that third phase, you fall back on your knowledge base, you tap into the responses that you've got from that person, and then you actively engage with their person. So far you've been asking questions, you've been getting an idea of what's happening around, and now you're actively engaging with that person's opposition. I think a good example would be you reading the abstract of a paper, understanding what they're saying, and then writing a critique. So in the leading question, you're going after their position. So to put it briefly, that's what we do in the third phase of the Colombo tactic.
Okay, but I'm a little confused about that because a lot of people have a very thin knowledge base,
Right.
and so if you're in a position of having a very thin knowledge base, what do you recommend for individuals in that particular situation?
Yes, and that's a great question, and that I think that is very key when engaging with apologetics and evangelism, because sometimes we think that we have the burden to deal with every objection that we face. deal with every person that we face, and be absolutely victorious in the dialogue. But as we know, that is too much pressure to put on any person. So in those instances, what I would recommend to myself, and obviously what I would recommend to everyone, is to try and enlarge that knowledge base. Reading books, getting hold of resources, podcast videos. Try and learn stuff. The better you know, the better it is. So enlarge your knowledge base. And the other point is, maybe even after you've learned so much, maybe there is some field that you're not an expert in. That's quite possible, and then you are dealing with a person who is an expert in that field. So in those instances, it's always good to say to that person, to be humble to that person and say, hey, I'm not an expert in this field, but you know what, I'm going to check back on the topics and we can come back and revisit this conversation. So it's good to enlarge your base, and also to be tethered to the ground reality that maybe you may not become an expert in every possible topic out there. So be humble
Yeah.
at that point and say, hey, let's go back and forth. I'm not an expert. You can tell me the points. I will revisit. I will check in some resources, maybe check with some friends, and we'll come back to this conversation. Or, as Greg Cockle suggests, you can let the conversation die a natural death, if you find that this is too much for you to take up.
Yeah.
And that's the whole point behind what Greg says about how we all play a different role in the conversation that we have with the person. Maybe we are just tilling the soil. Maybe we are just shaking them up for a conversation
Mm.
down the line where they would have with someone who is an expert in that very specific field. And maybe our conversation just opens them up to the possibility of Christianity being true. Maybe that's all it does. So we have to look into that sovereign plan of God, and be okay with the fact that maybe we may not get the answer to every single question out there.
Yeah, I think that so many Christians feel that pressure, and I like that word that you used, the pressure of having all the answers. But we don't. No one person can have all the answers. So it's okay to be in a position where you don't have the answers. You see
Yes.
that my video feed went away, but that's okay. I'm back now. so, that, so to be in a position where we don't have all of the answers. And I like what you said, where and you can buy yourself some time by saying, I don't know that. I truly don't know the answer to that question, but I'll do some thinking about it and come back to
Yes.
you. And so, but I do think so. Let's say that you do have a little bit of knowledge in
Hmm.
an area. So, and now we're talking about, when we're having a conversation, and you do have some knowledge about the topic that you're discussing. How would you? And I realize that there's not one question that will work in all situations.
Right.
But how would you kind of approach the conversation once you've asked, what do you, you know,
What do you
what do
mean
you
by that?
mean, and how did you come to that conclusion? And so then, what would you do next?
Yes. So there is two different ways that Greg Cockle also addresses, that I also see is plainly obvious in engaging with this third phase. And one is to just not add any new information, but to just connect the dots. So, for example, a
Hmm.
person might be asking you, well, why does someone have to believe in Jesus to be saved? And this is an example that he uses in the book, and I think this is very relevant also. So they might be Christian, they might be asking this question. So we just ask them this question: well, why do we need Jesus in the first place? And they would say,
Yeah.
because to save us from sins. And so we ask, well, does being good save us from sin? Does believing in the concept of God make us save us from sins? Does being plainly religious save us from sins? And they would say, no, it does not. And so all
Hmm.
we do is we just connect the dots by asking them these questions and getting their response, a different
Yeah.
form of the first two questions. And we just use the third part and just connect the dots. So we say, well, if this is the case, and if that is the case, well, then shouldn't this follow logically? And so in third phase, we may have to just do that, just connect the dots. With a
Yeah.
Christian or a non-believer, you just connect the dots.
Yeah.
Or you could go on the offensive and you could point out what could be their logical fallacy, the formal suicides, practical suicides, some sibling rivalry that they have in their points, some infanticide. These are the names that Greg Cockle uses to point out different flaws. And in that phase, you can engage in this format and bring to light the flaws in their reasoning, the flaws in their argument. But you
Hmm.
you have to be on the lookout. You have to be on the lookout from question ones to understand what their point is, and then try and find the gap if there is any in their argument.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. So I want to spend some time with you maybe in our next broadcast where we're talking about these fallacies, because
Right.
you just went through a whole list of those, and it'd be good for us to become a little bit more familiar with what those are. But how about in uh, let's say we're talking about the question of that. Well, somebody says, "I don't believe that Jesus is the only way to God,"
Hmm.
and then you follow up with a question. Well, what do you believe that is sufficient? And you say, do you think that you can be saved by just doing good works? And what about if somebody says, "Yeah, I think that that's the way that you're saved"?
Yes.
Where would we go
So
from there?
yeah, so with that person, my question would be, so in my preliminary question, I would try and see if they hold themselves to be Christian.
Hmm.
So if they hold themselves to be a Christian, whether they are a progressive Christian or not, or
Yeah,
biblical Christian, as many of us might put it that way, then I can pin down on the teachings of Jesus and Scripture to point out
yeah,
where they might have erred in their conversation. But if they are not a Christian and they don't hold Bible to this authoritative position, but they are
yeah,
not Christian and they say, well, Jesus said, help the widow, help the orphans, and that's all you need.
yeah, yeah,
I
yeah.
would still challenge them on them and ask, well, what did Jesus say when it came to salvation? What
Hmm.
did the apostles in the authority of Christ say when it came to salvation? And what was Jesus doing all about with his crucifixion? Did Jesus say anything about his crucifixion playing some sort of role other than just dying for a cause? And since they say, well, this is what Jesus says, I would pin it on that very specific point, go after that and ask, well, what did Jesus really say? Whether they are a
Yeah,
progressive Christian, traditional Christian, or a non believer, in fact.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I can think of a couple things that come to my mind, and hopefully I can remember them. but one would be how do you know how much good is good enough? I mean that if you think it, you can just if by doing good you can make it to heaven.
Yes,
Well, how would
that's
you know that?
a good one.
How would you know when you've done enough good? You know,
Hmm.
and so but also that the whole good enough question essentially completely negates the role of Jesus.
Right.
So, in other words, if you say, "I think that you can go to heaven by being good enough," is that, and Paul talks about in the book of Galatians, where he says that that if righteousness could be obtained through the law, then Christ died for no purpose.
Yes.
And so we would have to explore that question about, what's the meaning of Jesus's death? Is he truly God's son, or is he just a misguided prophet, or what?
Yeah,
But
and there's another verse in scripture that I really find relevant to this. It says that for our righteous acts are like filthy deeds, and
yeah,
it just brings you whole perspective that uh, there is not really much good that we can actually do, because our righteous acts, not just our good acts, but our righteous acts are like filthy rags. um,
hmm,
so that also puts into great perspective about the same point that you're saying about how much good can we do, and what are the deeds that we're trying to compensate, because people would obviously be trying to be compensating some of the wrongs that they have done. Well, what about your thoughts? How are you going to compensate for your thoughts? What about the harm that you've done to some person, and as a result they've died? Okay, what do you do about that? How are you
yeah,
going to make a difference in that
yeah,
instance? Does maybe financially helping out the family actually compensate for that? So that's a very good
hmm,
point to pursue, Curry. I like that thought.
yeah. Let me just kind of share a story from my own personal experience very quickly here. Is that I was driving home one day, and my wife and daughter, one of my daughters, was in the car with me, and one street that leads to my house has a stop sign on it, and
Hmm.
another street that leads to my house does not have a stop sign. And so I was, and it's right at the corner that goes into where near my house is at. And so I'm driving along, and I just turned the corner because in my I was lost in my thoughts or whatever, and I didn't realize that I was on the street that had the stop sign. And so I hear from the back seat in my car, my daughter says, "Nice stop, Dad." and, and then I realized I had broken the law. And so I was probably maybe 20 yards down the road when she made her comment. And so I
Mhm.
stopped in the middle of the street. There were no cars behind me. There were no cars in front of me. The road was clear. And I just stopped in the middle of the street. And my wife and daughter said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "Well, I'm making up for the stop sign that I missed." And we realize how stupid that is to think that you
Yes,
can make up for a wrong
that's a great
somewhere down
example.
the road, you
Yes,
know. Or even
exactly.
this,
Somewhere down
think
the road,
about this.
literally and
Say what?
figuratively.
Yeah.
Somewhere down the road, literally and figuratively.
Yes, exactly. But think about this. Suppose I came to another stop sign a day or two later, and I stopped twice at that stop sign.
Hmm.
That still does not make up for the wrong that I did at the other stop sign.
Right.
You know. Suppose once again, that if a policeman pulled me over and for running the stop sign and says, "I'm going to give you a ticket," and I would say, "Wait a minute, officer." I said, "Wait a minute. Don't you realize how many stop signs I've stopped at before? Why are you going to give me a ticket for this one? I've had a good record of stopping at stop signs, but none of that. It doesn't matter. I've broken the
Right.
law and I have a
Yes.
penalty to pay. You know.
That's
Now,
a good one. I think I'm
we
going.
seem to be able to understand that with civil law,
Hmm.
but when it comes to divine law, we think somehow our good is going to outweigh our bad,
Yes.
but we never can do that. You know, no matter how many times you do good, it doesn't erase one of the bad things that you've done. You know,
Right. Exactly.
so I know that's a little off topic, but
Well, that was a
yeah,
good point. I mean, I'm gonna make note of that example the next time this question ever comes up for me.
yeah. Well, that uh, we're almost out of time for this session, Jacob. That I'm wondering if there's anything that you'd like to share about these tactics, how to move the conversation from point one, which is what do you mean by that? Point two, how did you come to that conclusion? Point three, where we begin asking clarifying questions or we begin to pull from our knowledge base and,
Yeah.
try to
Yes.
get more
I would.
clarification.
Yeah. I would put out 3 points to sort of summarize on how to progress through each of these questions. First would be, you don't have to literally ask the exact same way that we've been dialoguing about. Like, you don't have to ask, what do you mean by that? Based on your
Hmm.
interaction with the person, whether it's a casual or a formal conversation, based on your language, you can modify and adapt to the situation and present the question.
Hmm.
The other point would be, um, don't take too much time going back and forth on these first two questions. Like, don't keep on pushing that questions to try and nag them into the conversation. Try and get some information, some valuable information, and then engage with the third question. And the final point that you need to keep in mind is, try and be sincere in your conversation. Don't try to be on the lookout to for a gotcha moment. Like, don't try
Yeah.
to merely win the argument. Be open, be sincere in your conversation. And like I've told you, Kari, like in our previous recording about how a 50-year-old man who claimed that he has not heard a single new argument for God since the age of 9. After me deploying these tactics and engaging with him, he said, "Well, these are new stuff, and you're making me think." And he said that he appreciated my honesty, and that's all you need to do. Just be honest, humble, and sincere with them, and
Yeah.
engage with these tactics, as simple as it is. And that's what I would leave you with.
Yeah, great, great. Well, I always enjoy speaking with you, Jacob, and that you have a lot of good insights, and that I know that you know your material well, and that's why I'm looking forward to our next conversation, where we can talk a little bit more about some of these fallacies. And
Yes.
thank you for spending some time with me today. I truly appreciate that.
Well,
So.
the pleasure's mine too.
If you're interested in becoming a better defender of your Christian faith, or be able to have conversations with people where you don't just feel so lost in that process. It's very helpful to learn some of these tactics that Jacob has been sharing with us. So I look forward to our next meeting when we can talk about some of these fallacies that Jacob mentioned in today's session. That's it for now. I'll see you next time.